Welcome, everybody. Nice to see everybody. Hi, Marcy. Nicole. Wow. Good to see you guys. All right. Michael, Vakasha.
תודה רבה. Let's share some screens here. Okay. Well, we have been offline for a few weeks. Welcome back for those who weren't here. And we're talking about an underground railway to get Jews into Israel. And we're talking about Kibbutz Kfar Giladi. So let's take a look here and see where we are. This is I don't even know who made this map, but it has nice colors. And in orange, we have Syria, and over here in pink-ish, we have Lebanon, and yellow is Israel. And the very top corner here, where the red arrow is pointing to, right even north of Kiryat Shmona, there is the site we're talking about. Here's another map, mainly about southern Lebanon, from the border of Israel to the Litani River. And you can see that the Golan Heights, where Meir and myself are at the moment, is considered Syria, but we're used to that. And right here is Kfar Giladi. It's just about at the tip where Metula is, very, very close, just a couple minutes away, and close to the Lebanese border, both from the north and also from the west, and from the Syrian border, pretty close towards the east. Very perfectly located. Another map, pretty much the same. This is a Google map, right up at the very border, almost, and kind of like what we call the Galilee Panhandle, or in Hebrew, the finger of the Galilee, above Kiryat Shmona, is Kfar Giladi, named, we talked about it before when we talked about Hashomer movement, named for a man whose last name was Giladi, and he was part of the Hashomer movement, and he died relatively early, and they named the kibbutz for him. So there's the Hashomer movement. In 1920, something happened. A lot of things happened, but the Haganah was founded, and it was a direct descendant of the Hashomer movement that we talked about before, one of the first Jewish self-defense organizations. Here they are at Kfar Giladi, even before they started the kibbutz, and they're on horseback, and they're trying to look like the local population, and they have guns, and they have swords, and they have bullets, and it was a thing. And when the Haganah started, many of the leaders of the Haganah were Hashomer people. But some of the Hashomer veterans, especially the folks that formed Kfar Giladi, did not believe in a small, intimate, secret organization like the way Hashomer had been for 11 years. The Kfar Giladi people saw themselves as elitists and trailblazers and helping to form a future state, but not followers. There were also some personal issues between the Kfar Giladi folks and the Haganah leaders, so they decided to start not only their own kibbutz, but their own organization, which they called the secret kibbutz, without the knowledge of the Haganah. The small group of activists began to build their kibbutz, and at the same time, they began their own military training, protecting their new village with defensive positions and procuring their own weapons. Along with this, they began building an underground railway for Jewish immigrants who wanted to come from Syria and Lebanon, even though it was against the British mandate law at the time. In 1921, the first secret weapons cache was installed in the kibbutz. In Hebrew, this kind of cache is called a slik, from the Hebrew word for putting aside. Here you can see on the left, the British could come in. There's no way they could tell what was going on. But when you pushed a bunch of buttons and moved the lever, you could actually move this gigantic machine to the side and go down into one of the bunkers that they built there, the cache that you can still see today if you go to Kfar Giladi. This became part of a series of caches hidden throughout the kibbutz. It was so secret that, of course, the British did not know where it was. The Haganah didn't know where it was. And actually, most of the members of Kfar Giladi didn't even know where it was. And in 1938, Avraham, who was the new head of security at the kibbutz, decided to contact Yehuda, the head of Haganah weapons purchases, and let him in on the secret caches. Yehuda was in shock. You can see an entire cave that they hewed out and the stuff that they picked up from various places. But after his initial shock, Yehuda soon realized that the kibbutz should build a new central hiding place for weapons, because he realized that Kfar Giladi is a perfect location for temporarily hiding weapons that will be available once Israel becomes a state. Anyone on the kibbutz who somehow heard details of this plan or saw work being done was told, don't discuss it. Lo medabrim al zeh. And this became a motto for the people of Kfar Giladi for years to come. So if you do have a chance to get there, when skies open up, then it's worth visiting these underground caches. Ever since Jews have been expelled and exiled from Israel, Jews have wanted to return. Originally, this return of the exile was traversed by land, since the first exiles were expelled in biblical times. But even in modern times, returning to Israel by land was always an option. And this was true, especially for those coming from Lebanon and Syria and neighboring countries. After the Ottoman Empire lost control of the land of Israel to the British, many Jews were excited at the prospect of open ingathering of the exiles. The local Arab population did not see eye to eye with the Jewish population on this subject. And the British, wanting to be relatively fair and to keep the peace, put a limit on the number of Jewish immigrants to Israel. Already in the early 1920s, Jews began to enter Israel by foot from the northern border. The first to arrive, immediately after World War I, were the Jews from Bukhara, Bukharian Jews, who came from Central Asia. This happened in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Most left their homes, and many arrived in Israel. After them came the Jews of Syria and Lebanon. They were usually assisted by Arab smugglers who knew the ins and outs of border crossings. Sometimes they were honest, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they robbed them, sometimes they helped them. The British reported to the League of Nations in 1934. Illegal immigration exists, and we are trying to stop the phenomenon. When the French were expelled from Syria, the situation of Jews in that country took a turn for the worse, and this hastened their Aliyah attempts, and the same was true for the Jews of Iraq after the British left their country. Kibbutz Kfar Giladi was one of the only Jewish villages that was right on the northern border, and they took a central role, in fact, the central role, in helping Jewish Aliyah, which again, according to the laws of the British Mandate, were illegal. During the entire time of British rule, from the beginning of the 1920s, straight through until 1946, when it stopped, they were in the middle and leaders in the bringing in of Jews to Israel. The very first time they were involved in secret Aliyah was when the British refused to grant entrance certificates to a group of Olim that had no work permits, and they were expelled to Lebanon. So 3 members of the kibbutz, who of course were former Hashomer people, they heard about this. They simply got together, traveled to Beirut, and brought those people straight back to Israel. One of the reasons that secret Aliyah to Israel via the northern border is virtually unknown is that it was dwarfed in size and in drama by the secret Aliyah efforts by European Jewry by sea, as you can see here, before, during, and after the Shoah. Over 100,000 Jews tried to enter Israel by sea, but by land, only 12,000 Jews were able to enter by land during that same period, and therefore we don't hear about it as much. And there were no really big movies like Exodus that were made about it. And perhaps it's about time that that happened, for those who know movie folks, producers and writers. Kibbutz Kfar Giladi was known as the center for pioneer spirit, Zionism, staunch idealism, ever since it was founded. In their eyes, helping Olim into Israel was a vital priority. They dedicated time, money, equipment, food, resources, efforts, and manpower to this cause. Some of the kibbutz members were active in the secret Aliyah efforts and went back to their countries of origin to help make that happen. And this effort, of course, took a toll on their personal lives, their family lives, but it also hurt the economic development of the kibbutz, which is a sacrifice that they made knowingly. The members of Kfar Giladi often disagree with the leaders of the mainstream Yishuv, the leadership of the Jewish people in Israel before there was a state. Of course, they weren't considered enemies, but while they shared a common dream of establishing a Jewish state in the land of Israel, but they were often at odds with them as to priorities. And the origin of this distrust is the story of Tel Chai in 1920, right next to Kfar Giladi. And they took responsibility for them and tried to help them get off the ground. In early 1920, the security situation in the area of Metula, Kfar Giladi, and Tel Chai was dangerously unstable. Here you can see it, they're just all alone there. The people of these border villages knew they had too few people, too few arms, and too little experience to hold out over time. They requested and then demanded and then begged the Yishuv leadership in central Israel to send people and arms to help them make a stand. But the answer was too little, too late. And on the 11th of Adar in 1920, Tel Chai was attacked. Yosef Trumpeldor and his comrades were killed and then buried afterwards, the famous roaring lion statue put above their mass grave. If there had been more help from the national leadership in sending assistance, so felt the people of Kfar Giladi, what happened to Tel Chai would not have happened. After Tel Chai fell, the people of Kfar Giladi and Metula left their villages for a few months until things quieted down again, and they did come back, and Kfar Giladi and Metula are still there today. But something snapped in the interim. Trust. People of Kfar Giladi simply stopped relying on the national leadership to help them way out in the sticks in time of need. They'd been burned once, and it wasn't going to happen again. They could rely only on themselves for people, for arms, for everything. The fact that they procured their own arms and hid them is directly connected to the historical trauma of Tel Chai and the abandonment, in their eyes, of Kfar Giladi and Metula. So if the residents of Kfar Giladi didn't trust the Jewish leadership for their own survival, they certainly weren't going to trust the British leadership for national survival. And in 1922, Britain published a white paper in which the number of immigrants to Palestine would be severely limited due to a lack of economic infrastructure, but mainly to appease the local Arab population who saw Jewish Aliyah as one of the biggest threats, if not the biggest, to their welfare. The white paper said, the number of immigrants to Palestine cannot be so large as to overreach the economic capability of the land at the time to absorb new immigrants. This is vital in order to ensure that the new immigrants will not become a burden on the citizens of the country and won't prevent employment by those already living there, which is an understandable stand. But for Jews, what's an economic crisis compared to life or death? So things will be hard. What's new? And for those Jews who were well off and still wanted to come and make Aliyah, there was another priority, and that is simply the return of the indigenous Jewish people to their homeland. For the British, by allowing a certain amount of immigration certificates a year, they were able to control the flow of Jewish Olim, as well as take care of British interests vis-a-vis the local Arab population by keeping the numbers low. But for Jews, this was not enough. One of the most amazing parts of this story is that there were some people who realized way before their time, as if they were prophets, that one day in the future, diaspora Jews won't always have the ability to leave their lands and come to Israel. And for them, it was now or never. That other people, Jews and non-Jews alike, felt, what's the rush? Here's an example. Our good friend Manya Shochat, whom we've highlighted here a number of times, was one of the old Hashomer leaders that continued to lead the kibbutz at Kfar Giladi. At first, in the early 20s, Jews would suddenly arrive at the kibbutz, usually coming via Beirut. She and other Kfar Giladi kibbutz members took it upon themselves to feed them, take care of them, and then get them past the big British roadblock in Rosh Pina to their next destination. At the time, Kibbutz Kfar Giladi had less than 100 members. There were times that there were more Olim in Kfar Giladi than members. Manya made a number of official requests from the national Jewish leadership of the Yishuv, asking for a simple, modest budget to cover the basic needs like food and clothing and money to pay off smugglers, etc. She later wrote that she was always given a negative answer by the leaders of the Yishuv, who said, "We don't recognize this aliyah. It can only do damage to the official British certificate-only aliyah." So she asked them, "What do you expect me to do when the Olim arrive at Kfar Giladi?" And their answer was, "Turn them away. You didn't ask them to come." But this was simply inconceivable to the vast majority of the people at Kfar Giladi, and of course the Olim themselves, and many Jews in Israel at the time. When someone is in need of help, you help. Here's another example that has to do with Manya also. One day in the 1930s, a group of 3 secret Olim, the survivors of a group of 15 people who had been walking to Israel for 8 months from the Soviet Union. It's just so inconceivable, I just have to say that again. They've been walking for 8 months from the Soviet Union to Israel. You know, we do the 3-day hike and people are exhausted. These people were walking for 8 months and they suddenly arrived at Kibbutz Kfar Giladi. Among them was a woman who was so sick and feeble that she was teetering between life and death. She needed to be taken immediately to a hospital. But how would they get her past the roadblock in Rosh Pina of the British? Manya contacted the sick woman's brother and told him to wait for her in Tiberias. And on that same day, some VIP tourists from America were visiting the upper galley in a big fancy car, and they stopped at Kibbutz Kfar Giladi. Manya, always daring, decided to put this sick woman in the trunk of the car without telling the tourists. This is classic Manya mode of operation. She did tell the secret to the driver, and then she asked the tourists if she, Manya, could ride with them to Tiberias, and of course they agreed. On the way, she heard noises and realized something was wrong and asked to stop the car. She checked on the woman who had lost consciousness. Manya had no choice but to reveal her secret to the tourists. They promised not to tell any Yishuv leaders about it, but instead, they simply went to the local British commander, who then told a man who was in charge of immigration for the entire British mandate, a Jewish man from England, whose name was Albert Montefiore Hymson. And when he heard about this, he was furious, and he summoned Manya to him for a warning conversation. According to Manya, this is what he said: "You folks are fighting windmills. You're idealists, but you're rebelling against the law of the country. We know you're helping to smuggle arms and illegal immigrants for the sake of heaven, but we will not build our national home without law and order. We must do it slowly and surely, with the cooperation of the British government and with total trust between Britain and the Jewish people. You are destroying that trust. Therefore, you are very dangerous people, and I must fight against you, even though I respect your ideals. You are bringing evil into Zionism and to the building of this country, and I will continue to fight against you full force." Actually, I think this is a fascinating argument. Both sides have good points. Perhaps Hymson, at the beginning of his career at least, simply wanted to build Israel in a different way and at a different pace. He wanted the future Israel to be built slowly with Britain and not against it. And yet he hunted down the people of Kfar Giladi and imprisoned them as much as possible. But the secret aliyah didn't stop, because from the angle of the people at Kfar Giladi and the Olim and their supporters, it's important to understand that they felt a sense of urgency that Chaimson and the Yishuv leaders didn't feel at the time. However, as time marched on, things changed. First of all, Chaimson himself changed his tune. Although in the beginning he was a Zionist and a friend of Chaim Weizmann's, as time went on, he distanced himself more and more from Zionism, and in the end became a fierce opponent to the entire Zionist enterprise. In the mid-1930s, after 14 years of service, he became meaner and more hated and was forced to leave his job. But another thing that changed was the entire attitude of the Yishuv, the Jewish leadership. People realized that bringing Jews back to Israel was actually, yes, an urgent priority. What made people change their mind? Here are just two of some of the game-changing events that happened. One is called the Farhud, which you can see here in a picture. In 1931, a pogrom took place in Baghdad against local Iraqi Jews. This is known as the Farhud. At least 200 Jews were murdered, some say hundreds more. 900 Jewish homes were destroyed, property and synagogues were looted and demolished. Although many Iraqi Jews actually returned after a while until their mass exit of almost 150,000 Jews in the early 1950s to Israel, the news shocked the Jewish world. Jews in Muslim countries began to seriously consider Aliyah, and world Jewish opinion concerning the urgency of Aliyah also changed. And of course, number two, an obvious no-brainer, the Shoah. Once World War II began in 1939 and the destruction of European Jewry became public knowledge, Aliyah became an official priority of the Yishuv, with an organization that was formed to run the show in foreign countries, and the Palmach helping the Olim at the borders of Israel. It was only in the 1940s there was finally a budget for Kfar Giladi after more than 20 years, and other kibbutzim and villages who helped the Jewish Underground Railroad. So, if we move on time-wise, Aliyah officially became a priority, and an organization was formed to make it happen, and it was called Mossad Aliyah Bet. Aliyah Aleph was the British condoned certificate-only Aliyah. Aliyah Bet was Aliyah that was against the rules of the British and was secret Aliyah. So the man who was chosen to lead Mossad Aliyah Bet is Shaul Avigur. And Ben-Gurion himself, who changed his tune, said, after these two things happened, the burning priority of the Yishuv Zionism is to dissolve as many diasporas as possible, as quickly as possible. And Shaul Avigur, seen here, said, the Jews in Arab countries are in mortal danger, and we're talking about 800,000 Jews. These leaders were influenced by a famous speech given by Manya Shochat, known as Breaking Down the Wall, during a national convention in 1942 in Tel Aviv. She said the following: the main mission of Zionism today is to open the gates of the land of Israel for free Aliyah. The British have denied this to us. How will we break down the wall? After spending 2.5 years in America and England, it's clear to me that the diplomatic channels are totally blocked. But there's another way. We must strengthen Aliyah Bet and move it forward. In 1923, 1.5 million Greeks moved from Turkey to Greece. We can do this too, and bring the Jewish masses to Israel. 1 million people. That's my suggestion for a minimum number for this program. 1 million people. We have to accept this principle and then start making it happen. A classic, historic Manya speech. And 1 month later, Ben-Gurion spoke at the Biltmore Hotel in New York City. That's Ben-Gurion on top, and down below is the actual convention. And that's where he presented what was known as the Biltmore Plan. He upped the ante and said he had planned to bring to Israel 2 million Jews. But unfortunately, as the scale of the Holocaust became clear, Ben-Gurion stated at a meeting of the Jewish Agency Executive in 1944, my minimum used to be 2 million. Now that we have been annihilated, I have to say 1 million. Despite British efforts to curb Aliyah during the 14 years of Mossad Aliyah Bet, 110,000 Jews immigrated to Palestine. And then during the first 5 years since the establishment of the State of Israel, from 1948 to 1953, 720,000 Jews immigrated to Israel. That's almost 1 million. We had indeed been annihilated, both physically and emotionally. Many people who might have otherwise come to Israel simply didn't have the strength for another colossal challenge. I remember as a young kid in Kansas City asking my grandparents, why didn't you move to Israel? And they said, after what we went through in Germany, we were simply too tired. Throughout the 1920s and most of the 1930s, there were no houses in Kibbutz Kfar Giladi. We did have a dining room and work buildings and a barn, but people lived in booths and tents. And yet the Olim kept coming, and they hid them either in the second story of the barn between bales of hay or in the chicken coops. Manya was the treasurer, the accountant, and the representative of the kibbutz. The person who was in charge of literally taking care of the Olim was an amazing woman named Chaya Kroll, of course, one of the Hashomer. She took care of every Ole from 1921 to 1946. That's a long time, 25 years. This included hiding them, feeding them, clothing them, caring for their medical, physical, and emotional needs, and all this in secrecy. Taking care of the Olim became such a priority for Kibbutz Kfar Giladi that they not only paid the price literally in money, and food that they shared, and clothes that they just handed out, that the kibbutz itself was prevented from developing in the way that they had planned. And yet, despite the price they paid, no Ole was ever turned away or not cared for, ever. Some had been lied to in Beirut. Some had been lied to by smugglers. When you get to Kfar Giladi, you'll get to stay in a luxurious hotel. Ironically, today there's a luxurious hotel in Kfar Giladi, but at the time, when many of these people arrived at the kibbutz, they were furious at the lies they were told because they'd been put in a barn. And they sometimes took it out on their hosts. But most of them, of course, realized that these poor kibbutznikim were helping them out of the goodness of their hearts, and they were full of gratitude. The members of Kfar Giladi were poor. They barely had enough to eat themselves, but they never stopped feeding the Olim that arrived. When it was cold, they got hot tea and hot chocolate and fruit and cheese. And when it was hot, they got the same thing cold. Most of the people who made Aliyah on foot arrived at Kfar Giladi were from Arab countries, but hundreds also came from Europe, especially after the sea options became more difficult. Before World War II, some groups would come from Europe to Beirut as tourists and then secretly go south and cross the border with the help of local smugglers. But as time went on, it became harder to cross the border and more dangerous. The British knew exactly what was going on. They caught groups of Olim now and then, but they weren't able to stop the phenomenon of secret Aliyah. And I decided to grab a couple of interesting stories from Kfar Giladi just to tell about some of the interesting things that they experienced through these 25 years of secret Aliyah. Menachem, a member of Kfar Giladi, told the story about one of the local women who was in charge of the kibbutz, a very strong-willed person, and like all the women there, and she suggested hiding Olim in the women's shower room. When the British soldiers would come near, she would say, "How dare you enter the women's shower room? Are you ashamed?" And then, being British and polite in general, it worked for a while. There was another man, Shlomo Kostika, who came from Damascus to Kfar Giladi in 1933 with a crazy story. And this is what he wrote. By 1933, it was obvious to my family that I needed to leave Damascus and get to Israel. My brother Yosef, who already lived in Israel, came to Damascus to help me prepare. It all had to be secret. Only my family knew, but we had a big family. In the end, we parted. My brother Yosef and another organizer named Abraham and I got on a horse-pulled wagon and went to the center of town. Yosef said goodbye and made his own way to Kfar Giladi to let them know we were coming. We got on a bus and joined others, and we were now 10 relatives together. We got through Quneitra smoothly, and when we arrived at the Banyas River, a guard got on the bus and checked us and let us continue. We could see the statue of the roaring lion in Kfar Giladi where Trumpeldor was buried. He knew about that. And we were all excited to be so close to Israel. The Arab smugglers that had been hired told us to get off the bus in an orchard. And there were shouts of arguments between the smugglers as to who would lead us to Kfar Giladi. Abraham calmed them down and made a compromise. 2 little kids would be carried on shoulders. Aliza, who was 2, was held in her mother's arms, and she started crying, and we were all in danger. Nobody could calm her, even her mother. The smugglers told us to leave her, but of course, this wasn't an option for us. It became very dark, and we started walking. 2 smugglers in front and 1 in back. We asked how long it would take, and they said, we're 1 cigarette away. On the way, the dishonest smugglers demanded all of their money, which was supposed to be paid only upon reaching Kfar Giladi, because they said we were already there, but we weren't. They refused to move. We were afraid they were going to rob us or hurt us. Avram suggested that the 2 of them go with my brother Rachamim to Kfar Giladi, and then they'll get their money. We waited and waited, and then Olga and I decided to go on our own to Kfar Giladi. We got lost and decided to return to the group. We couldn't find them. Suddenly, a policeman on horseback appeared and screamed at us, "Get up, you dogs!" And he cursed us. They had already caught the other group, including Avram and the smugglers. They brought us to an Arab village, to the leader of the village, who was very nice and gave us food and water. Avraham carried Aliza, and we were made to walk to the police station of Khalsa, which is pretty much today's Kiryat Shmona. Yosef and Rachamim were there too. They had been caught also. Afterwards, a wagon from Kfar Giladi arrived at the jail and brought us bread and cheese and butter and milk and jam. We were so excited because it was our first Hebrew meal. After 4 days in jail, they let us go, and we were forced to return all the way to Damascus. So my first attempt at making Aliyah failed. The second time also failed because somebody told the authorities about us. But the third time, I made it. And then the last line in the story is, I was sad after the first attempt because I really wanted to have my bar mitzvah in Israel. And then you realize Shlomo is 12 years old. Unbelievable what these kids went through. Later, he got to Israel, grew up, and joined the Palmach. He himself became a leader in bringing Jews from Syria and Lebanon to Israel. Many of the Olim from Syria and Lebanon who arrived in Israel became the first members of the undercover unit of the Palmach that looked Arabic and spoke Arabic and worked on the other side of the borders of Israel, and also in various intelligence units that became the forerunners of Israel's intelligence communities today. Another story is Aliyah became an official priority of the Yishuv. People were sent all over the world to help Jews move to Israel. Until then, the communication between Kfar Giladi and Beirut was done, believe it or not, by little notes on scraps of paper that were passed back and forth. In the 1940s, 2 members of Kibbutz Kfar Giladi working in Mossad Aliyah Bet, including this man, Grisha Shinkman, were able to erect an antenna in Beirut that could communicate with Kfar Giladi and with Haifa by Morse code. They decided that the best location for this antenna, a place where the British would never look, would be on top of the British embassy in Beirut, on the very flagpole that was flying the Union Jack. Once, a former Nazi who was a former member of the Nazi Party was stuck in Syria and managed to get to Kfar Giladi with a Muslim man from Kurdistan. The German man, very daring, introduced himself as Kalman and faked himself to be a Jewish refugee who had just escaped from Europe to Turkey. But we had very sharp instincts, and we suspected something fishy was going on. And we asked one of our members from Germany to come and talk to him, and they were caught red-handed and turned over to the British police. And finally, here's a story of the big battle between the British and Kfar Giladi on October 10th, 1945. There was a group of 78 Jews from Iraq who desperately needed to get to Kfar Giladi. The leader of the group was named Yehoshua, who told the following story. We told the Palmach unit to meet us at a certain place on Erev Shabbat, but they misunderstood us and thought we'd come on Motzei Shabbat. So we arrived at the fence, but nobody was there to meet us. I personally did not know the path to Kfar Giladi, so we had to wing it. It was terrible. Stones and thorns the entire way. When we arrived at Kfar Giladi, there were already British policemen there, and they tried to stop us. The great bell of Kfar Giladi rang, and this was a sign for everybody, adults and kids, to come and mix themselves up with the group of immigrants. The British called for reinforcements, and then Kibbutz Kfar Giladi called for reinforcements from the neighboring villages. But we knew one thing: we're not going to turn anyone over to them. We will simply not let that happen. The British didn't stop the group from entering Kfar Giladi, but they counted them. And then 2 British officers came to the gate and demanded us to hand over the immigrants. And of course, we refused. More soldiers and cars surrounded the kibbutz. Hours went by. Soon, people from the area kibbutzim came and surrounded the British soldiers who surrounded Kfar Giladi. One Arab machine gunner in the British force opened fire on kibbutzniks who came from nearby Manara and killed a few of them. The British officers were furious and ran over to stop the firing, thereby saving many lives. The wounded were brought into the kibbutz, and the British did not stop this. In the evening, after a long, long wait, the British received their orders: retreat. A huge cheer from all went up into the air. We were victorious. We paid a heavy price, but we won. I wanted to sum up some of the things that we talked about. We mentioned this evening a very important Jewish value: the right of Jews to return to their indigenous homeland. Think about how history came full circle for some communities. Jews were exiled from Israel to Babylonia in the 6th century before the Common Era. 25 centuries later, in the 1940s and 50s, almost the entire Babylonian exile, Jews from Iraq, was dissolved as Jews came back to Israel en masse. When you think of Aliyah as part of mega history, it's a very powerful story. On the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept as we remembered Zion, is the famous song. After 2,500 years later, there was no more reason to sit and weep. You don't have to remember Zion. You can live it. So first of all, we have to understand the strength it took, physical and emotional, for Jews from these Middle Eastern communities to leave their homes and everything that was familiar for them and return to their homeland by foot. They paid a huge price in every conceivable way to walk to Israel. But also, we have to remember the people who helped them, who greeted them, who believed in them, and who cared for them. The members of Kibbutz Kfar Giladi, more than any other place, made huge sacrifices to help their fellow Jews return home. And for decades, they did this without a budget. They took the little food that they had and they shared it with strangers. They weren't underpaid. They weren't paid at all. And they did it while being criticized by Jewish leaders in the beginning and chased and imprisoned by British clerks and soldiers until the very end. Only later were their actions considered positive and mainstream. These were visionaries. From 1920 until 1946, over 12,000 Olim came to Israel by foot across the northern border. This simply could not have happened without the amazing members of Kibbutz Kfar Giladi. And another amazing fact, they took in any Oleh without asking them what their political affiliation is or their belief systems. They didn't care what their gender was. They didn't care what they were wearing, whether they were nice or in a bad mood, whether they were religious or secular. And in those highly politicized days, this was a minor miracle. And the truth is, even today, it might be a miracle. At one point, due to a desperate situation, it was decided to help 1,000 children from Syria make immediate aliyah to Israel by foot. This number sounded impossible in such a short time, but in the end, they managed to get 1,400 children out of Syria in a very short time, and their parents came soon afterwards. Over time, the Damascus diaspora was almost entirely in Israel. Somebody once asked a member of Kfar Giladi, "Why did you do this? Why did you sacrifice so much just for Aliyah?" And one of the members said, "I don't really know. it was something very deep inside of us. It's hard to explain. I knew that we couldn't build Israel without our brothers and sisters from all over the world. That's what Zionism is, helping Jews who want to return home. But if we don't help them, who will? We had no training for this. We had no budget for this. We had no planning for this. We just had the Jewish value of Aliyah as the wind to our backs. And that, folks, is inspiring. Toda Rabah. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. If not, I hope everybody has Shavua Tov.
You said 12,000 people crossed by land. How many do they estimate crossed through the kibbutz?
Close to 10,000. Somewhere between 8 and 10,000.
So most of them.
Almost all of them, yes. There were a few who came to other villages on other parts of the border, but most of the time, most of them came through Kfar Galadi, the vast majority.
And you mentioned Manya Shochart. Can you tell me how to spell her last name?
Sure, Shochat. Her husband was from a family who were butchers. Shochat. And Manya. There are a number of books written about her. She's a very, very fascinating, controversial, but fascinating woman who changed history. Mamash.
And why didn't the British just close down the kibbutz if they knew all this was going on?
The British were very concerned about how they were viewed in the world. And there were gentlemanly agreements between the Shuv and the British, because often they were gentlemen. Sometimes they weren't. But there, for instance, opening fire. In general, except for that man who was a local Arab man who was furious at what was happening, the British didn't open fire. But this meant that the Jews also, and the people of Kfar Galadi, who had all these weapons stored away, also had kind of like an understanding that they don't shoot at the British. Now they could, but in the end, it wouldn't be in their best interest. And so there were certain things that were acceptable and certain things that weren't. And closing down the kibbutz was not one of them. What they did was they tried to nail people red-handed, and they were successful. But there were so many people who were part of this machinery that they'd set up that it was just a matter of time until other people would take over. And so they didn't close down the kibbutz. They did bring the numbers down. And in 1946, actually, for the last 2 years of the British Mandate, there was no entrance at all into Palestine. They totally closed the border. But that perhaps was one of the advantages with all the problems of the British, and they did some pretty terrible things. But this gentlemanly agreement was pretty much adhered to. There were some exceptions, Beria, where they tried to start the Tower and Stockade movement, but in general, the kibbutz that was already there, they weren't going to close it down. And what they did is they tried other ways, and I think in general, compared to other countries that could have been in charge of the mandate, there were some positive things in the fact that the British were doing it and not other countries.
What happened to the woman on the way to the hospital?
In the trunk of the car.
Say that again?
The woman in the trunk of the car, what happened to her?
She was reunited with her brother and got better, believe it or not. I do not know her name. It's a crazy story. It's just so manya of a story. Only she would think of such a thing and have the chutzpah to do that. And she wrote a lot in her memoirs about her work there. And she meticulously, she was known as the kind of person that would go to a baseball game and write down on the score sheet what was happening. You know, how many people still do that? She was one of those people that crossed the T's and dotted the I's, so she knew exactly what was going on. She wrote down everything, and including the conversation she had with Chaimson, who I could not find anywhere a picture of. it's also a very fascinating phenomenon of a man who considers himself a Zionist, a personal friend of Chaim Weitzman, who believes in a future state of Israel, but with the British running it from the Balfour Declaration and on. And he looked at these people as the crazies who were going to ruin everything because he didn't see things with an urgency the way the others did. He was like, what's the rush? Let's take our time. And I think there's something to be said for that approach. But the other folks, the folks at Kfar Giladi and the Olim themselves definitely felt a sense of urgency, and that's where things clashed.
Were there people
of course,
from
once the state of Israel was founded, things were a little different, and pretty much most of the people kind of got together again. But there were very big arguments about how urgent things are, and this is something that I don't really understand. You know, like how did people have this sense of history when it was? I'm not sure if I was there at the time, I would feel that there was something urgent that had to happen until 1931. But this was already 10 years after the people at Kfar Giladi had been running the show. And it's just fascinating that they somehow were able to understand this. And that is something fascinating.
Were there people who were imprisoned and punished from the kibbutz who ended up
Yes,
in jail?
yes, there was a number of people who spent years in prisons. One man, Akiva Feinstein, even though he had a very Ashkenazic name, he knew Arabic, he looked Arabic. He was the number one man who knew every single stone and every pathway, and he got groups out of impossible situations. He was caught, he escaped from prison, he was able to get people to bribe him out of prison, and once he was caught, I think for the 5th time, they put him away in maximum security, and for the last 3 years of the mandate, from 45 to 48, which were critical years, he was in a cell. And this happened to a number of people. And so they were successful in imprisoning people, but it wasn't enough to stop the actual project from continuing. There were too many people, and the Jewish folks knew that when they were planning this, you always had to have a next in line just in case you got caught. And that part is also no less fascinating, that it continued on no matter who was caught. Tov. Mayor, please go ahead, Jake.
When the white paper came out, how many Jews were allowed to immigrate into Israel?
I believe the white paper said that 85,000 Jews would be able to be allowed in a 5-year period. And at one point, Chaimson said, every Jew that they count coming over illegally, they're going to take off of the certificates as a way to pressure. And that put the Yishuv in a very tough situation. And in the beginning, since they wanted to choose the people who would be able to come in, and then it got a little ugly there, there was a big clash between the Kfar Giladi people and the Yishuv. That changed, of course, as time went on. But after the Farhud and in the 1940s, especially after World War II, it was obvious that 85,000 people in 5 years is nothing. It's nothing. And it was totally agreed on by almost everyone in the Jewish world that what the British were doing was unethical, certainly in the wake of the Shoah, and all systems go for it. It's and so what started as just a few people became a gigantic worldwide movement.
Just a
So,
history.
Mayor, toda rabah and toda for everyone who's here. Have a great week.
Thank you.